Andy Austin here with the next chapter from The Rainbow Machine, Tales from a Neurolinguist's Journal by Andrew D. Austin. You can buy it on Amazon and all good bookshops. This is the bedwetting chapter, where I give some strategies by which I deal with bedwetting, or have dealt with bedwetting as a therapist, and different strategies and things available to people. And this originates from Viktor Frankl's work. And he wrote a book, From Death Camp to Existentialism, which was his experience in the Nazi death camps. With his work and that particular book becoming quite popular, unfortunately, a lot of that writing has been reinterpreted and reimagined by a lot of therapists these days. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. In the later publications, it was called Man's Search for Meaning, which conveyed a much better title, I think, for the modern day ethos that people have adopted from that book, which is the people that survived the death camps were the people who found meaning. They had a higher reason, they had a purpose, they had a mission, and those were the guys that survived, and everyone else succumbed to the brutality and the torture and everything else that went on in those camps. And so how this gets interpreted these days is that hopelessness and helplessness can be overcome when we find meaning and purpose in our lives, and therefore we have a reason to live. And that's a very popular thing that is taught by keynote speakers and people for after-dinner speakers, motivational speakers of all forms. And it's a very popular thing, and no one really likes to question it, because Viktor Frankl himself was a person he was a doctor, and he was in the death camps, and he survived, and these were his observations. So who could criticize him? Well, I can. Because here's the problem that I have. It's a bit of an issue with survivor bias here. All the people that succumb to the disease, the typhus, the gas, the brutality, the beatings, the shootings, they're not around to tell us how important their lives were. And it's very, very easy to have this notion that everyone who survived, they had a reason to survive. And that it was their mindset, their determination, their will, that kept them alive. No, some people survived and a lot of people didn't. And it's very, very easy to attribute. This is the thing in business too, it's just the same thing. Millions of businesses start up on a regular basis, and so many of them, most of them fail. The ones who survive always attribute it to, or you see them on YouTube, my proven 7-step system, how I got it. And it might not be. Statistically, some people will succeed. And those that failed, it wasn't necessarily because their business was rubbish, although some of them will be. It's simply because it didn't work for them. It might work in another context at another time. There's so many variables. And so there's a survivor bias. And so we see this actually as a very common thing with people. With this Man's Search for Meaning, how it's been reimagined by people, it's the same thing. I've seen coaches quote from this book as a way to say that if you believe, if you have determination, if you have sufficient faith, because it's just religion reimagined, then you will succeed and you will triumph and you can be anything you want to be. I've got some issues with that, as you can probably tell. It's a nice idea, but I'm just not convinced that this is the all-powerful thing that it is portrayed to be. But of course, if you're that motivational speaker from the stage, you have to have something to talk about, to instill hope and drive and motivation inside people. So these are good stories when you're getting paid $1,000 an hour kind of scenario for your speaking from the stage. You got to tell them something, so these are good stories. But I do wonder what effects this actually has in the real world, and how many people believe and believe themselves into an early grave, or believe themselves into bankruptcy and a whole load of other stuff. I heard this a lot within the NLP world. Now, I've been on the peripheries and involved with, in varying degrees, the NLP world since around about 1994. I have lost count of how many next big things emerge on the scene. And there's a bigger plot. There's all the website. There's the squeeze pages. There's the videos, and everyone knows their name, and then they're gone again. Next year, there's another lot come through, and then another lot. And some make it as a speaker. They're speaking about the thing they're selling. It's like the coaches coaching to coach coaches to coach more coaches. And it's like the marketers who are excellent at marketing to marketers. But if you give them a real world product to market, they can't market it. This is a problem. Now, the bedwetting chapter is all about paradoxical intention. And this is not about having ultimate success and everything else. This is about practicing your problems. This is about mentally rehearsing and deliberately inducing the very difficulties that we face in our own personal lives, our own minds, and so forth. A lot of these things that really bother us happen outside of conscious awareness. Now, Frankl's paradoxical intention method forces that into conscious awareness. So in the bedwetting chapter, what I recommend people do, if you're a bedwetter, is to deliberately piss the bed. And then get in the bed and spend the night in the wet bed. Yeah, it's not very nice. And that's quite a good method for really addressing quite a few of the unconscious issues that people are otherwise avoiding. Because when I suggest this to my clients, they don't like it, as you can imagine. And lots of objections come back, and so I can now track, okay, so what comes spilling out of that interaction, and what can we do with that material? Other stuff you can do with paradoxical intention that works quite nicely are things like anxiety and panic attacks. I've worked a lot with anxiety over the years. I think it's probably the number one category of issue that I work with. It manifests in a whole load of different ways. One of my favourites was the client. This was when I worked in Southampton. The client who was terrified of the supermarket, and in finding out, okay, well, why is supermarkets so scary? I might have a panic attack in the supermarket, and so this person had made lots of pictures in her head of having panic attacks in the supermarket. Now, when in looking at, okay, so what happens if you have a panic attack in the supermarket? And of course, in her mental pictures, maelstrom of chaos and ambulances and sirens and everything, the whole world comes to a halt because, oh my God, she's having a panic attack in the supermarket. So I thought, okay, let's just put this to the test. So I suggested about paradoxical intention, and that didn't go down very well. So I thought, let's do something else. So we went down to Safeway. Now, where I lived at the time, I lived in the student part of Southampton, and just on the corner from where I lived was a nice little Safeway supermarket. And it was where I used to go and do all my shopping. And so I went in there, and my client was stood kind of at the window entrance area, not really wanting to go in, and she didn't know what I was about to do. And I walked down the aisle, and I just fell to the floor. I just lay down on the floor. Let's just see what happens next. And of course, now she's in her head, if that was her, it would be a maelstrom of chaos and activity. And actually what happens next is absolutely nothing. People stepped over me. I think people thought I was probably drunk, or probably just one of the local crazies, or on drugs, or one of the crazy students. I was probably in my mid-20s back then. And because I'm in Studentville, so a lot of pranks and silliness and all sorts of other stuff would go on in the areas, and people are quite used to that kind of stuff. And essentially, for me lying on the floor in the aisles of the supermarket, absolutely nothing happens until somebody comes over and goes, "Are you all right, mate? Are you all right?" And gives me a bit of a shake, in which case I then get up and say thanks ever so much, and carry on. So I made real the kind of situation that the person was so terrified of, was desperately trying to avoid. And that, it didn't cure the panic attacks. Of course it didn't. That doesn't cure the panic attacks. But it provides a nice set of leverage in terms of now we've got something to work with. It's not quite what she thought it was. So now we've got something we can work with much, much easier. With the whole thing about bedwetting, what I like to do, and I don't see those sort of clients so often anymore. For some reason, people don't ask me for those kind of interventions. What I would look at is what are the beliefs and values around the particular issue. And the easiest way to get into those beliefs and values is to suggest and propose the person does that very activity itself. Other stuff that is useful with paradoxical intention is by mentally, deliberately bringing on the symptoms and repeatedly rehearsing it. You're beginning to develop a mental mastery over that system, over that symptom set that previously was happening outside of conscious awareness. And with repeated practice, bring it into conscious awareness and then under conscious control starts to make an enormous difference. And one of the things I advocate, especially if I'm working with people who have lifelong or long-term quality of life issues that affect every aspect of their life. I'm thinking in terms of the clinical depressives, the borderlines, the schizophrenics, the people with chronic lifelong anxiety issues and so forth. And OCD is another one. I say to them, why are you not an absolute expert in these symptoms? Why haven't you read every psychiatric, psychology and psychotherapy book on this subject? Why are you not the absolute master of this subject that you experience? Because when you bring this under self-mastery, now you can start to do something about it. But people don't. They don't actively and deliberately engage with their symptom set. They don't want the symptom set, so they seek to distance themselves from it. And I give an example of the distancing language that people use in that particular chapter. So by getting people to take an active involvement to actually master, control, and be the symptom, have it under your total will, dominate it, control it. Now you have a very different quality of life. But of course, what we have to be able to do is get the person to be willing to engage at that level. What most people are doing is simply trying to avoid and move away from the suffering and the set of symptoms that they've got. And then herein lies the problem. Therapists and coaches and counselors across all the different spectrums that exist will indulge that. And they will engage in years, months, sometimes just weeks, but a lot of money usually, in trying to alleviate the symptoms, to alleviate the suffering, and won't do the very thing that could actually make an enormous difference for that person. As always, comment section below. Do please share your story. Let me know what happened for you.